never had a sense of self. I was always searching for that. It took a while to find my own voice, and I feel like I needed to exercise these demons. That was the hardest thing I think I had ever done up to that point. I mean, I drank a lot, trying to get through that, and I've been a depressive since I was a kid, so I was probably the most depressed I'd ever been.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Beyond the Process, where we explore the art of storytelling via interviews with creatives in the fields of comics, storyboards, film, animation, and video games. I am Lance Laspina, and if you happen to watch last week's episode, perhaps you got to know me a little bit better. So today I thought we'd flip the script and get to know Mr. Shane Patrick White a little bit better. He's my co-host, and it's ironic because this used to be Shane's channel. But there may be people tuning in for the very first time, Shane, who might not know you that well. So for those people, could you please take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, I will. Let's see. That's always been the problem is trying to encapsulate what I do to people. So I try to keep it simple by just saying I'm a artist writer who lives in the Pacific Northwest. I've worked in comics, video games, and a host of other things for 30 plus years. And so I always bounce around from thing to thing. But mostly I've been making a lot of my income from doing storyboards for commercials and video games, as well as some concept art and comic books. It just keeps going.
As long as I've known you, you've done a myriad of things, and you're selling yourself short with that intro. So we're going to dig into it, and I'll get to expose you a little bit better in terms of all the different talents that you actually have. But so you and I have known each other for, I think it's about 28 years now, which is a long time.
Yeah.
And so I have no doubt, even though we've known each other that long, that today I'm going to learn something new about you, and I'm going to be surprised.
Oh, we'll see about that.
Yeah. So in that same vein, and doing a little bit of research for this interview, I happened to dig up a Wikipedia page of yours. I'm not sure if you had anything to do with that, but
probably.
Probably or definitely.
Oh, most definitely.
Definitely. Okay. But I was really surprised because I thought I knew you and I thought I knew where you were born, but you have it listed on there that you were born in Louisiana. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
My dad was in the Air Force at the time.
Mm. Okay. So how old were you then when you moved to upstate New York?
Well, let's see, that was back in 1970. So I think my parents were only there for like 6 months, and then they moved to Ohio. It's like Akron, Ohio, where my dad went to an electrical training school to become an electrician. Mm-hmm. And then we were there maybe a couple of years, and then my folks ended up moving back to where they grew up in northern New York. So, yeah.
So that your parents had a tie there originally.
Yeah, they were
New York. Okay.
Yeah, they were originally from northern New York.
I guess I shouldn't say upstate because it's actually northern. Yeah, there's a difference there, right?
And we'll get everyone considers. Yeah.
And what did you call it? What was that known for? The nickname of the area.
Well, it's called the North Country, but I mean, the reason why a lot of people say upstate New York is because they only look at New York as being New York City.
True.
And everything from New York City is upstate. So it could be as far south as, Poughkeepsie, but we're still like 3 hours north of Syracuse, which most people know Syracuse,
Near the Canadian border?
Yeah, along the Canadian border.
Okay. So I always think that, the way people end up in life and what they end up doing is shaped through their childhood. So I'm interested in learning about your upbringing in the North Country of of New York. And
Mm.
what was it about that place that kind of shaped you, if it
Um,
did at all?
no, no, it really did. I think it was the lack of everything. You
Mm,
know, the lack of culture, the lack of people. You know, it was very rural, and so you know, growing up in the '70s, it was very like both my parents worked, and so you had a lot of your own time. And so I'd be out in the woods all the time, just making up stories or imagining things and just trying to get on with life. I think a lot of people in my generation were considered latchkey kids.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So, you know, you'd come home from school and you'd just be by yourself until your parents came home. And it's just like,
mm-hmm.
just keep the doors locked and watch cartoons if you have your homework done,
Sure.
or, you know, bring in wood because the wood stove has to keep going throughout the winter. So, but there was a lot of natural, you know, a lot of nature, you know, and so you're always either battling the really cold winters or the muggy summers. And, um, so yeah, I've just kind of left to my own devices. I'd
Okay.
get into all sorts of trouble. So,
And when you think about that time, do you look upon it fondly?
aspects of it, yeah, you know,
Okay.
there were aspects of
Okay.
it. I wouldn't say
Mm-hmm,
it was an easy childhood. You know,
mm-hmm,
my dad was in the Vietnam War, and you know he
mm-hmm,
came back, and you know he had some struggles that he had to deal with, but a lot of
mm-hmm,
that, you know, that childhood was you know rife with yeah, different kinds of abuse. You know, but
mm-hmm.
the stuff that
Sure.
you have to deal with. You know, it's one of those things where you can't just come back from a war and think, oh, everything's peachy
Mm.
keen, you know, and
Right.
there's a lot of adjustments. And my parents were pretty young when they got married, and
Mm,
they were young when they had me. So I
mm,
think having gone through those ages myself, I, you know, realized like the
mm-hmm.
responsibility was way over their head, you know, to
Sure.
have a family at such a young age. So,
Sure. Okay. And do you think that helped forge you into the person you are today in terms of your beliefs and what you ended up ultimately doing with life?
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Hmm.
in I guess I always looked at it like my parents um, were hard workers. Uh,
Hmm.
they 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 just always worked. Like my dad was a workaholic. You know, he
Hmm.
just always worked and instilled in us a certain integrity in terms of if you want something, you got to work for it. And so I'd always dig in and you know really just attack anything that was um, that was put in front of me, except
Hmm.
maybe schoolwork. You know, I wasn't very
Hmm.
good in school. You know, there was
Hmm.
something about either my upbringing or who I was that I was, I guess I would say, a little hyperactive.
Hmm.
You know,
Sure.
whether physically or my
Hmm.
imagination, and I I think I had a hard time concentrating, and I would rather be physically doing something. And
Hmm.
so I don't know if that was because of all the work I was doing, or the work was a way to get me to calm down or settle down.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think too. It's just that like my mom's the creative side of the family. Like she's an artist,
Hmm.
but
Okay.
she did a lot of different things. She taught me how to use pen and ink and watercolor at a really young age,
Hmm.
and my dad's you know sort of insistence on work, I think those two
Hmm.
meshed together basically was in my DNA.
Hmm. So is that how you came about to gather an interest in art and doing something creative for a living? Was through your mother teaching you initially watercolors, and then it went from there?
Well, I guess I like every kid, you know, I was drawing at a very early age, and so at the age of
Hmm.
2 I was drawing Spider-Man, you know.
Hmm.
And I remember in kindergarten the teacher said, she told me I couldn't paint anymore because I was painting legs coming out of people's heads. And so my mom, I came home crying or something, and my mom went into the teacher, and she was like, you better let him do what he wants.
Yeah,
That's what art is all about, is just being
sure.
creative. So back off, lady.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think art teachers back in well, I don't even know about these days, but maybe at that level of schooling, they're not probably the most trained to get the most out of their students. They're
No,
just
not
there.
in the 70s. No,
No, no, definitely
it was
not.
a very different time.
So you mentioned that you used to draw Spider-Man. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious. Now, I know you have a very strong love for all things comics, and I'm
Hmm.
curious to know how that started. So, what was your first exposure to the comic book world?
Well, my mom actually, we had some markers. I think we only had like 3 or 4 markers
Mhm.
because I mean we were I wouldn't say dirt poor, but we were not wealthy by any chance, by any stretch.
Mhm.
Um, so we had some scrap markers and colored pencils or whatever, and so I remember my mom drawing like a real Spider-Man. It wasn't stick
Mhm.
figure with a Spider-Man face.
Huh.
So she drew
Huh.
this Spider-Man, I think, based off a John Romita comic or something,
Wow.
and so then I copied her drawing, but
Hmm.
in doing so, I I meticulously sort of like looked at her drawing and traced the outline. So by the time
Hmm.
it was finished, it looked like it was Spider-Man with a big dick, So, and my mom was like, "Oh, okay, that's nice." So
That's hilarious.
I didn't,
Oh my God.
I didn't know what it was I did wrong, but it made her laugh,
As it should.
as it should. Yeah.
So I'm I'm curious. So you said your mom is the first one to have drawn Spider-Man. Now, did she have an interest in comics, or did she happen to come across one of your comic books, and that's why she drew Spider-Man?
Well, I mean, the first comics I had no covers. I don't know where they found these comics. They were just these scrap comics in a shoebox under my bed. And so, when she was a kid, she used to read comics. Like, she used to tell me she'd hang out in an apple tree reading, different comics or whatever. And my dad said he might have read some comics, but he doesn't remember. I don't know. And so they weren't, yeah, they didn't actively buy me comics until when comics were back in the day, comics would be at a grocery store. You could find
Sure.
them everywhere: grocery store,
Hmm.
drugstore, and they'd be
Yep.
bagged up in these 3 comics to a bag.
Hmm.
And she'd get a bag of comics for like 75
Hmm.
cents or 50 cents. And so
Right.
there'd be something cool, and then in the middle would be something crappy.
Right.
But
Exactly. Yeah. You
every
toss
so
that aside.
often, yeah, every so
Yeah.
often you'd get something that was decent.
Hmm.
So that's kind of how it started. Then this was like before I was still in elementary school, but I think when
Hmm.
I turned 12, it hit me. It was like, oh, you can make a living doing this
Mm.
for real?
Okay.
Like there are people that do this. Like it's like when you ask some people, where does milk come from? They're like, oh, the grocery store. But in this case, I was like, somebody actually drew this. And I remember it was like, I think like you, it was a
Mm-hmm.
John Buscema Avengers comic. And I was
Mm.
like,
Okay.
yeah, I remember actually tracing. Was it tracing or drawing? I think I was just trying to copy a Thor, an image of Thor coming over the wall. Um, but yeah, even going back further, I remember comics. I remember the colors and the shapes of the covers,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember being scared of Medusa, from the
Uh-huh.
Inhumans, or Doctor
Yeah.
Doom. I was just like, oh,
Yep.
this is fearful.
Yep.
So. And so from
Yeah.
that point on, from the age of 12 onward, I was just like, I'm going to draw comics. And so I just drew an hour every day. I never missed a day until like I was 23.
Oh my
I was
gosh.
always drawing. But
Yeah.
it's like that thing that 12-year-olds do. They find something, and they're finally coming into their own, and they want to own it, and they want to just consume it. whatever it is. And it was
Mm.
around that time too that I got a unicycle. So I got it for Christmas and I couldn't wait to ride it. So I tried learning how to ride it on our icy driveway. And I just
I'm,
kept falling and falling and slipping.
oh
I should have
God.
had a helmet. This was
You don't have
before
it.
helmet.
Too bad we don't have any video of that. That would have been great to see.
Oh yeah, I wish I did. But after like 3 weeks, I learned how to ride
Yeah.
it. I could ride it on well, not on ice, but it was
Sure.
that level of determination that
Yeah.
said, I'm gonna do this, and then you figure it out, and it's just like that was the kind of tenacity that
Mhm.
and perseverance that stuck with me. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought from that point on, anything I do, that's the
Mm.
mindset, you
That's
know.
the way you're going to attack it. Yeah. Yeah. As long as I've known you, you've always been that way. And it's one of those things that like I feel guilty almost because you work so hard at everything and you
Mm.
never like your persistence is so amazing. And I feel like I'm slacking all the time. I'm like,
Oh
I have to keep
man,
up with Shane's level of determination. It's amazing.
not
No,
not at
no, it's
all.
no, it's admirable. It really is. Getting back to comics and comic books. Now, did you also have an affinity like I did growing up as a kid for the Sunday comic strips? Or was it just strictly comic books? Like, did you
Mm.
ever like? I used to love getting the Sunday papers and going through. My mom would always hand me the Sunday comics and I'd read them. Of course, I had my favorites. Calvin and
Mm.
Hobbes was always one of my favorites. But
Oh
so I'm
wow.
curious if you had a similar experience.
Yeah. Yeah,
Hmm.
I was addicted to the line work of everything. My grandfather always had the comic strips off to the side near his chair, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I would always, when we'd go over to their house, my uh, grandma and grandpa White, they'd have the newspaper, and I would just go through that and read that. And so I just started clipping out cartoons. You know, I
Hmm.
clip. I was into Garfield for some stupid reason. I don't know why, because
I like Garfield.
he was a
Sure.
sassy cat. You know.
Yeah. Hmm.
But yeah, I clipped that. I would clip out editorial cartoons, and I would
Hmm.
get photo
Hmm.
albums, and
Hmm.
I would just have tons and tons of comic strips. I don't know why I
Wow.
did that, because then I'd turn
Wow.
around and I would buy the Garfield books that
Hmm.
had all the strips in them, and I'm like, what's my problem? Again, this is this weird addiction with
Yeah.
things.
And so, any other interests besides art and comics? Did you have
Well,
any
yeah, I
other
mean,
interests growing up
like
as a
Mad
kid?
Magazine was a
Hmm.
huge influence on me
Hmm.
in the, let's see, it would have been like 79, 80. I mean, I
Yeah.
think my aunt got me a Mad Magazine and it just
Hmm.
blew my mind. I was like,
Hmm.
oh my God, this is so funny. And so then my friends and I in school, we used to draw our own version of Mad Magazine. We'd come up with just the silliest shit, but it was like, this is elementary school, mind you. So
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
drawing things like the Ronald McDonald gang with like Grimace the rapist and the, and the Hamburglar who's just
Sure.
armed with Uzis and shit, and it was just like I I don't know where that stuff came from,
Oh,
but
that's great.
just I don't know. I just had this fascination with like really fucked up stuff.
Yeah,
So
I used to do this. I loved Mad Magazine as well as a kid. And I used to do
yeah,
the same thing. I actually used to, how you used to in the back, you would fold the page into like a three fold, and once
yeah,
you
Al
folded it,
Jaffe.
then yeah, it would create a new image. I used to
Yeah.
try and make my own versions of
Oh
those as well.
wow,
But
wow.
and some of my favorite artists, let's see if this rings a bell. Mort Drucker
Oh yeah, more
and
trucker. Yep,
Angelo Torres, of
yep.
course.
Jack
Um,
Davis,
Jack Davis was phenomenal. Oh my gosh.
phenomenal.
Who was the guy who used to do the cartoons inside the borders?
Sergio Aragonis.
Sergio Aragonis. Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to forget him.
That was the thing. It's like I could remember every comic that I had because
Hmm.
I started collecting comics at the age of 12. So I could remember every comic, every artist, every writer. I could remember all the artists and writers in Mad Magazine,
Hmm.
but I could not tell you anything about the Declaration of Independence. I didn't know anything about the Emancipation Proclamation of 18 whatever, you know. But I was so locked on to things that I was interested in that
Sure.
it I don't know. I don't know if that was good or bad, you know. But my
So,
recall for that stuff was
yeah.
important because I could look at line or I could look at art and I
Hmm.
could tell what it was. And I could do that with film too, which
Hmm.
was kind of strange. Because like when I was a kid, I used to memorize the entire TV guide. So like when a clip of a show would come on
Hmm.
and it would be like maybe 10 seconds, I'd say, oh, that's Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, 1967.
Wow.
Like I could
Wow.
do
Yeah.
that because I could tell the film grain or the quality of the film. If I saw an actor, I'd be like, oh, okay, I know he was in, this, and this at this time. And then I don't know,
Oh,
I could do that up until
yeah.
I was 40, and then all
Huh.
that changed.
You may have been on the spectrum there for a bit.
Maybe,
That's quite
maybe.
a talent.
I always thought I thought it would be useful someday, but I
Yeah,
don't know, just never did. It was good for party tricks.
for sure. So getting back to comics, and you said you discovered that you could actually do this for a living. So who were some of the biggest influences on you at that time,
Hmm.
both artists and writers?
Um, let's see. I mean, at that time, I was reading a lot of Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, Daredevil stuff. That was huge influence on me. I just like the grittiness of the city. There was John Byrne. Um, he was just kind of like he could draw everything really well in his style. It was just there was just something about it. You could tell that he loved Jack Kirby, and I don't know, everything he touched just sort of had a quality about it that I really liked. Um, John Buscema, of course, and his inker Tom Palmer were like the best combination. I just absolutely love their stuff. Jack Kirby obviously was an interesting influence because I didn't like him at first, and then
Hmm.
I slowly started to understand what I was seeing. That it was about graphic design, it was about
Hmm.
simplification and creating iconic images.
Sure. Yep.
So, and then there was like Marv Wolfman and George Perez on the Teen Titans. That
Hmm.
was a huge influence.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I mean, there was just tons. I was just soaking it all in. But the thing is
Hmm.
I never tried drawing like anybody. Like
Hmm.
I don't know why. I it never occurred to me to
Huh.
draw like my favorite artist because I don't know if I had a favorite artist. And then when I
Sure.
saw Bill Sienkiewicz's work, I was like,
Hmm.
that's the guy. There's something about the fact that he doesn't have a one style. It's like
Hmm.
he could migrate through all this stuff that he was influenced by Bob Peak, these
Hmm.
old illustrators and Bernie Fuchs uh, and so when I saw that, I was like, oh, there's no rules here.
Yeah.
We can do whatever. You just have to be really good. And but even he started off drawing like Neil Adams, and Neil Adams was a huge influence, actually.
Sure. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, because he was doing stuff with panels that nobody else was doing, and the
Right.
realism. Yeah.
So when you said you used to force yourself to draw an hour a day, were you just drawing from your imagination, or were you looking at these comic books and drawing out of the comic book?
No, I was drawing from my imagination, and I
Hmm.
was using lined paper because I didn't have any art supply. I didn't have access to, you know,
Hmm.
copy paper or anything like
Hmm.
that. So, I'd get my aunt who lived in Syracuse would send up some art supplies every so often, and so that was amazing. But they were so precious, I wouldn't use them.
Hmm.
I would like hold off on using them, and
You'd save them.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so I'd write and draw my own comics. So I created my own universe
Mhm.
uh, and write my own storylines and come up with
Hmm.
my own just everything line of stuff. And maybe I would draw 3 or 4 pages of comics, and then that was it.
Mhm. Hmm.
Uh, yeah, and it and at the age 15, I started doing mini comics.
Hmm.
I found small press. I ended up somehow saving all my lunch money. I should be like
Mhm.
6'8", but I did not eat at all. So I ended up using my lunch money to order comics
Uh,
online or not online. Yeah. Back when
Back
there was
then,
no internet.
wow,
Back
you're a
then.
pioneer.
Yeah, I was. Uh, but no, we found a thing called Westfield Comics, which was a comic book place, I think in Chicago or somewhere in Illinois. And so my friends and I would pool our money together and place one order. And so we'd get this box, and I'd get the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I'd get all these comics like Judge Dredd, like when I first saw Brian Boland's work, or Carlos Esquera. And I was just like, my mind was blown, and then my first issue of Heavy Metal. I mean, that's like the rite of passage next to, your first issue of Playboy. It's like, holy crap, there's other artists in the world. The world is so big.
True. Yeah.
Like one of my favorite artists of all time is Juan Jimenez. It's his watercolor and ink stuff is just, I don't know, so fantastic. I mean, his imagination was endless. And so, so yeah, again, I started getting influenced by those guys. But in the back of one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics, you could write to Eastman and Laird, and so I would ask them, "How do you break into comics and this and that?" So they sent me like a pack of information, photocopies, and a letter. It's like, "Oh, if you need to do this, and here's a small press,
cool.
what do you call it?" Resource that you can find. So there was a magazine called Small Press Comic Explosion by a guy named Tim Corrigan. I think he was somewhere out of New York, and you could advertise mini comics. And so I started getting these mini comics, which basically were Xerox copies of comics that people did, and they'd come in like a variety of different colors. They'd have colored paper, or but it was just, this sort of grassroots small press thing, and everyone was doing this by mail. So you would, send a quarter here, or, you'd trade somebody here. So I did that for like 3 years, and
were they called zines, or no? Was zines something else?
It's kind of like that. I mean, it's just a core. It's like a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper folded, and you'd have like a 8-page comic. And so just used to do that, and then it was just kind of that first foray into publishing, and then I went to art school after that. And I'm like, I'm so locked into comics, like this is it. And I toured different schools. I went to the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Arts. My mom put me on a bus ride, 15-hour bus ride down to Scranton, PA, where my aunt lived, and then she drove me to Rockaway, New Jersey, and I checked out the school. And I had a third cousin who was going there at the time, and he was like chain smoking, and he's like, "Dude, this is tough. This is really a tough school. You got to give up your life." And I don't know. He looked like he had a 30-yard stare, like Sergeant Rock. I felt bad for the guy, but I was just like, "This is amazing." Seeing original art. It was the first time I actually saw original comic book art.
Wow, no kidding.
Yeah. So like on the walls of the waiting room, there was like Steve Bissett and John Tuttleben, I think that's how you say his name, and Joe Kubert, all these legacy guys.
So did you apply there or no?
Well, I did, and then Joe Kubert called the house, wanted to speak to my dad, and he told my dad that this is a very tough school, and you just want to make sure that I was committed, that this would my dad. This is like kind of the only time my dad stuck up for me in terms of art, or he's like, he's a hard worker, he'll do the work. And so then I talked to Joe, and I think that's after that I went down to check out the school. But for as much as I loved comics, I realized that if all the money I'm saving for it, because I think my mom and I were the ones who were going to foot the bill, for me going to school. I was like, I don't think I'm going to get as well-rounded education as I need, because I knew there was more to life than comics. You have to understand, I was crazy. Like, I was starving so I could go ride my bike 5 miles to a gas station to get comics. But at that time, I was like, I can't go here. There's just no way. I wasn't impressed with the school. It was a little disappointing. I don't want to speak badly of it, but it was not worth the money.
It's not what you expected. Yeah. Okay.
No, it was disappointing.
So ultimately, where did you end up going to school?
The Art Institute of Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And how did that come about? How did you choose? Because there are art institutes in
all
various
over.
cities in the United States. How did you end up choosing Pittsburgh?
Let's see.
Proximity? Or
No, not really.
no?
I actually was looking at the Manhattan School of Visual Arts too,
Mhm.
but I was, coming out of the '80s with the Bernard Goetz, subway shootings and stuff. I was
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
God, New York City sounds like a madhouse. I'm like, I live in, cow country. There's no way
Right.
I could survive. So I saw an ad on MTV when they used to play music and
Hmm.
for the art institutes, and I'm like, hey, a school where I don't have to do math or science or any of those extracurricular things. I could just
Yeah.
concentrate on art.
When I'm serious, I think about art school.
But I like to work too, and I like to design things.
If you have an interest in a career in art, think about the Art Institute. The Art Institute will teach you how to draw, how to take pictures, and how to design interior spaces. It takes 2 years of intensive training to earn your degree. And we have schools in 8 locations. When you're finished, we'll help in your job search. Call 1-800-237-3000.
So again, my mom put me on a plane at 15 and I flew
Wow.
down to Pittsburgh and I walked around the city and I saw the school and I was like, yep, this is it. It gives you everything you need. And if I want to do comics, I have the gumption to do it. So it was really wild because I mean, at 15, I was used to being on my own in the woods and doing shit that most kids today would never do, like
Right.
make, Molotov cocktails and uh,
Let's hope they're
squirt
not
gun,
making them these days.
squirt guns with gasoline. And
God.
oh yeah, I was making flamethrowers and shit, man. I was great. I wanted to be a stuntman when I was younger. I was just like,
Really? Wow.
oh yeah, I was jumping off roofs. I was,
Oh my
hurting
God.
myself. Yeah.
See, I knew I'd learn something about you. But you also, in that same vein, I read you also wanted to be an actor. Is that true?
Oh yeah.
Or was it more
Yeah.
stunts? Or both?
It was really acting. I mean,
Hmm.
I loved film early on, but I lived in northern New York.
Hmm.
How the hell do you get into acting? Like Hollywood is 2,000, 3,000 miles away. There was
Yeah.
no way,
Yeah.
I just I guess I thought it was silly, like a silly
Hmm.
dream, and so and impossible really. But my mom got me into acting classes and stuff, but I
Oh.
never really got picked for any roles. Like
Hmm.
at the end of the session, there'd be like a play or something, and I'd always be
Hmm.
like this ancillary character. So I didn't really grok the acting thing until much later.
Fear, I do not know the man I should avoid so soon as that's Cassius. He reads much. He's a great observer, and he looks quite through the deeds of men. He loves no plays as thou dost, Antony. He hears no music. Seldom he smiles, and smiles in such a sort as if he mocked himself and scorned his spirit that could be moved to smile at anything.
And then at some point, I started realizing, directing could be a choice.
Hmm.
And then when I found comics, it was like, oh, I could do it all. I could do it all right here. It's my little stage, my
Hmm.
little play, and I
Sure.
could affect the light and the color and all that stuff. And
Yep.
so that was it. I was like, I had big dreams, but I needed, I guess, a small stage
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Comics, you get to control everything too. You don't have to rely on anyone else
Yeah.
to do any of the work and be let down ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey gang, it's Lance here. Thanks so much for tuning into our YouTube channel today. Shane and I are just getting started with these series of interviews. We could really use your support and help getting the word out to everyone. So if you're enjoying what you're watching so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. In addition, it would be great if you could like the video and share it with a friend. Thanks once again for watching and enjoy the rest of the video. So I'm curious now, you grew up in northern New York. You're very secluded, and then all of a sudden you're going to school in a city, not a gigantic city like Los Angeles or New York, but it's still a pretty good metropolitan sized city in Pittsburgh. So
Mhm.
what was that process like to all of a sudden be dropped into this? Because I think the Art Center is actually near downtown, isn't it?
Art Institute was
Art
on.
Institute, sorry.
No, it's okay. I did want to go to Art Center, but oh well. Art Institute was, yeah, is downtown, as they say in Pittsburgh.
Downtown
Downtown.
Pittsburgh.
It was on, I think, 6th Street.
Okay.
If I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, it was.
Okay.
I just remember it being so freaking cold. Like we would have our big ass portfolios. Like it was funny because the school would issue everybody these really massive portfolios, and that would have all their supplies in it. And I walked across that bridge once, and the wind was picking up, and it was like a wind sail. I'm like, fuck that. So I put everything in a smaller portfolio case and put everything else in my backpack, and that's how I rolled. But
Okay.
but you do that every day, and I only went to school 3 days a week, so that left a lot of time to do homework and work. And so I don't know. It wasn't a hard school. I kind of wished it was harder. So I ended up hanging around after school and getting jobs from teachers. They would float me some freelance gigs here and there. So
Really? Like what kind of like, is this where your love for graphic design came into play? Or no, was that later?
Well, yeah, later. That was later.
Okay.
But I
All
mean,
right,
I
we'll
would
talk
do
about that later.
illustration jobs, and I worked on at an animation studio up in Sharon, PA. I'd take the light rail or whatever it was called back then.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, it was I did a Tom Petty video for Running Down a Dream. Did some cell work and some painting, and it was in the same animation studio. It was called Anavision. It was the same animation studio where they did Creepshow.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was.
Creepshow.
So there was an opening to Creepshow that was animated, and that's where they did it. And they also did this is crazy because I don't know why they still had this all set up, but they had the remember the Sam Raimi Evil Dead 2?
Absolutely. No, I love that.
And the grandmother coming out of the basement. Well, they actually had that basement floor there on the soundstage.
So strange it would be snowing in September. That thing in the cellar is not my mother.
I touched on your love for graphic design. I'm just curious where that entered into your life and how you learned to do that.
That was much later. I ended up a girlfriend at the time was real into graphic design, and she taught me a lot about it. And I don't know, gravitated towards the combination of text and fonts, and I was really into Dave McKean, even though he was in comics. His graphic design sensibility was just pervasive in everything at the time. And there was another graphic designer, David Carson. The way he handled typography was just amazing. I don't know if you ever saw the magazine Bikini or Ray Gun.
Ray Gun, I'm familiar with, not Bikini.
Yeah. Yeah. It was just fantastic stuff. And so I used to get a lot of communication arts magazines and How magazines, and they would have these design annuals, and I just loved that stuff, and more of that came along as I took on different jobs after school. So
okay. Was there ever a moment where you thought, well, maybe I want to be a graphic designer instead of an illustrator?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you always enjoyed doing it all.
Yeah. I mean, as the course of my career unfolded after school, I mean, the first job I got out of school was I had two choices. I could either design Dixie cups and packaging for McDonald's Happy Meals.
Wow.
Or I could go illustrate T-shirts where they were doing licenses for like Batman and the Rocketeer and Looney Tunes and
cool.
Simpsons. I'm like, I want to go do that. That looks like more fun.
So you graduate Art Institute in Pittsburgh, and then do you first move back to Northern New York? Or
there was no going home.
Okay, so
I was out. I left. I mean, I left school I left home at 17 and never looked back. I was just like, go.
Wow.
I'm out of the North Country, So yeah, it was Pittsburgh and then Indiana for like 2 years. where I illustrated T-shirts and created my own line of T-shirts and broke sales records and all that fun stuff. And then
cool.
I learned a lot from a lot of people there. There was a really, really talented crew. It was like the first and last time I got to work in a studio with artists doing traditional materials.
Yeah. And you're doing
Mostly.
screen printing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we would do the illustration and the separation, color separations for the screen printers. And then we'd shoot that on a photostat camera and send that across the street to the printing plant. And then they would print thousands of shirts for Kmart and Target and all these major chains.
Wow.
So,
and
but yeah,
you had a limited color palette, I imagine, maybe like three colors.
No, it was an 8. It was an 8 color palette.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think that was an 8 or 6 or 8.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's pretty good for screen printing.
So I was drawing everything from like Harley Davidson motorcycles, you know, all the little gears and wires and stuff, to making up my own stuff, my own IP. So that was really fun.
And they let you do that.
Yeah, yeah, and it was crazy because they would ask me to come up with a line of shirts for this or that season, or you know, sometimes like when we were working on the Rocketeer, we would get updated scripts. You know, here's the 4th script, and here's the latest script, and we'd read.
That's
so
awesome.
like the version of the Rocketeer I read was a lot more violent than what ended up being filmed.
Oh wow, how cool!
I wished I would have stolen that script because that would have been amazing.
That's pretty cool. So when you were inventing your own IP, did you get royalties for it, or were they just paying you work for hire?
They gave me some kickbacks here and there. I'd get like 500 here or 500 there.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, you know, for a kid, you know, right out of school making $15,000 a year.
That
was nice.
Yeah.
So
especially back then. That was during the 1700s, something
the
1790s. Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Yeah, definitely.
So moving on to Take Two, I'm curious to know how you found out about Take Two, and then tell me about your interview process and how you were hired there.
Back in the day, you'd see stuff in the newspapers. It's like, you know, looking for creatives or artists to work at a game studio, must be comfortable working in 256 colors. I'm like a box of Crayola crayons? Like, what are you talking about? And so, yeah, I interviewed at a couple different places. The first place was, there was only 2 game studios. There was one in Latrobe, and then, Take Two was in Latrobe, and then there was another one in Greensburg. Yeah. There was another place in Greensburg. So I interviewed at the one in Greensburg first. And it was like in a hotel or something. And I show up early, and there's a guy who's this big guy eating a donut. He's got powdered donut all over his face. And I'm like, oh, hey, I'm early. And he's like, you want a donut? And there's or Coca-Cola. And I'm like, for breakfast? Nope, I'll pass. He's like, here, take this art test. And so I'm like, okay. So I answered a bunch of questions. And then the last thing is they wanted you to draw a wizard on the back of the paper. I'm like, draw a wizard? What the hell? So I drew this fucked up wizard. You know, I didn't do the whole pointy cap, you know, bullshit. I was just like, I wanted him, you know, with an engorged eye and like drooling. It was all fucked up. So then I went into the next room to interview the people with the people who were in charge, but they had a chair in the middle of the room.
Oh my gosh.
And the 3 of them were like way down. They were against the wall. And it was like,
was this like an Inquisition or something?
Yeah. I felt like it was like Marathon Man, you know, it's like, is it safe? You know?
Is it safe?
My gosh.
It was really messed up. So they asked me a bunch of questions, and then they said, can we see your portfolio? So then I had to get up out of the chair and walk, and then open the portfolio and just sort of sweat it out as they looked at my work. And they said nothing. And they said, thank you. And then I said, is that it? And they're like, yes, we'll be in contact if we feel you're right for the position.
Right.
Great. Huh. So then I went over to Take Two, who also had an ad around the same time, and showed them some stuff. And at the time they were starting a different division. It was going to be a PlayStation division, and the
Okay.
main studio was going to be PC. So they were working on a game called Ripper, and we started working on. Well, we didn't know anything about 3D, so this was at a time when you could actually learn on the job. So they were teaching us how to use 3D Studio, which was before 3ds Max.
And of course, that's where you and I first met. You had already been there about a year when I started working there.
Yeah.
And then we ended up working on Black Dalia together, doing various roles, essentially.
Yeah, I was all over that game. Holy shit. I was doing puzzle design and story design and concept work. And
I was going to say, you concepted out the entire environment, like every environment essentially that was in that game, you had to design.
Yeah, and that was just watching tons of film in my personal library and photographing antique stores and just dove into it. It was an absolute joy. I love that game. There was just so much about it that I liked. I art directed the packaging photography session, which was tough because I had to. If you remember the cover, it was a half nude female, and to sit through 20 half nude, females
sessions,
models that came in to try out for the role. I don't know who could have done it.
It's a good thing they chose you. Yeah, you had the fortitude and the stamina to make it through. Yeah,
I think the stamina is really what we're talking about.
Let's not go too far. All right. So
anyway,
that's a story I don't remember hearing from you before. So was that after I had left? Probably, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Because that was toward the end of the project when you're doing the packaging.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because you must have left right after we filmed the killer stuff.
I think so. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, because there was that intro with the killer sharpening knives and cutting a leg bone with a saw.
Exactly. Yeah, once we had that all shot and then edited together, I think that's when I might have departed. So
I was sad.
I'm sorry. I was sad too to leave you guys. It was a fun crew. I mean, I loved everyone who worked there. I thought we had a really talented group of people. I just knew I had to get back to California. And speaking about moving west, what ultimately spurred you to quit, essentially working at Take-Two Interactive, and then move west to Seattle?
I got tired of old money. The thing about the East Coast is that they weren't paying people what they were worth, and fighting that constantly was terrible. So the thing is on 2 games I had worked crazy hours. Like on Black Dalia, for 6 months, I was working. Well, let's put it this way: I was sleeping 2 hours a night.
Oh my gosh!
And I had my sleeping bag there, and I would go over to my friend's place to take a nap at lunch and eat, and then come back and do it again. But instead of I would stop working at 5, and then from 6 to whenever I would work on my portfolio. I did that for 6 months straight, because the first time I did that was on another game on Ripper, and I ended up getting $2,000 as a bonus, and I put in crazy hours.
Wow.
And I was like, this isn't gonna work out. So I did it again, but this time I did it for myself. So I learned how to do compositing on the Flint compositing system, and I didn't do it very well, but I did it well enough to sort of say, hey, I know my way around it.
Sure.
And so I made like 33 demo reels where I actually made the packaging for it. So I cut all the stuff for the VHS tapes. I made a little inserted book with illustrations and all this graphic design stuff. And so I sent them out to a ton of studios because I wanted to get into film. And I knew some people working at VIFX, and I knew some people working at James Cameron's studio. I always forget that name.
Oh, Digital Domain. Yeah.
Digital Domain, and
Hmm.
so we set up stuff with them and Blue Sky and Blur, and but
Okay.
so we originally went up to Northern California and
Hmm.
brought our tapes to ILM, and I got into ILM and interviewed, and they were like, this stuff looks good, but we're not hiring until October. Can you come back? And it's because they were hiring for their next set of Star Wars films, and
Okay.
I
Wow.
wasn't really a Star Wars guy.
Hmm.
It wasn't my thing. So I was like,
Yeah.
all right, and I didn't think any more of it, because I'm like, wow. I talked to an art director there. We went out to lunch, and he's like, I've been here 5 years, and I have. Sir, he's been there 7 years, and he had like 5 roommates. He's like, he
Oh
was
my gosh.
barely getting by. I'm like, what? Like, what are you kidding?
Wow.
So I'm like, this doesn't sound good. So then I went down to LA and interviewed at a couple different places.
Hmm.
I was at it in VFX. They
Hmm.
were working on Titanic, and they were working on that Nicolas Cage film Face Off.
Hmm.
And they were
Yep.
saying, oh yeah, starting rate for the 3D modelers is like $45,000. I'm like,
Mm.
in LA? Are you? Oh man, it was just a weird vibe. And then I
Yeah.
interviewed at that one studio you were working at,
Hmm.
working on Baby
Yeah.
Geniuses, and I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't like kids, and I really don't like to animate kids' faces.
Not Dr. Frankenstein.
At some point, I ended up getting a gig, an offer up in Seattle
Hmm.
at Boss Game Studios.
Okay.
So yeah, it was one of the two places that I had a chance to interview at that I ended up going
Hmm.
with. So
And there you would remain for
yeah,
until to this
till
day, to
now.
present day.
Yeah.
Um, I want to get into the books that you created, the comic books. I want you to talk a little bit about that. Your first big publication was North Country, and we already mentioned, of course, that that's the area where you grew up. So it was to a certain extent autobiographical. Is that correct in saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So how long had that project been kicking around in your head, and how long did it ultimately take you to produce it?
Oddly enough, it really wasn't kicking around in my head. I don't
Hmm.
know. It was a weird circumstance. Like I guess I had come up with some vignettes of my life, growing up in northern New York, and
Hmm.
I had a bunch of vignettes, and I illustrated a couple, and I had an idea of the kind of comic I wanted to do. I was definitely more into indie comics at the time, and
Hmm.
I thought this was that kind of thing, and uh, that would work for for that medium. And so I ended up approaching a publisher at San Diego Comic-Con and showed it to
Hmm.
them, and they were like,
Hmm.
"This is great." I said, "Oh, thanks," and they were like, "Yeah, let's publish it." I'm like, "What do you mean? Like as it like?" He's like, "Well, what's the story?" And I was like,
Hmm.
"Oh, I got to come up with a story. Why did I not come more prepared?" So I had to basically string together these events of growing
Hmm.
up in
Wow.
post Vietnam, northern New York.
Hmm.
And basically the idea was that it was about a guy going home, and he's reliving all the stuff that's happened to him. And on the plane ride, it's this really rough plane ride. And as the plane ride gets really tumultuous, so does his real life, or his remembrance of life. And then it is mostly a story about forgiveness. And it took about 3 years to illustrate and the entire thing. So
So from that first meeting with the publisher in San Diego, then it was the 3-year process to
yeah,
complete it, and they were still
yep,
open to publishing it. Of course, the same publisher, correct?
yeah.
Hmm.
They knew they were familiar with publishing stuff. A lot of
Hmm.
times they would import graphic albums from France or Brussels or Italy, and
Hmm.
they'd reprint them. So
Okay.
yeah, they were comfortable with that.
With waiting for you.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
didn't
okay.
mind the wait.
Okay.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's one of your best works. I remember being really impressed when I first read it because there's so much truth and honesty in it. It might not be like your typical comic book per se, but because it's coming from a very personal point of view, and there's nothing. I mean, you do infuse moments of heroics and imagination and that sort of thing from the child's point of view of what he remembered, but it's not a typical superhero comic book. Of course, that's what you grew up on doing.
Right.
So I guess what I'm getting is, if you're going to produce your first major work, what made you want to produce this instead of choosing to do like a superhero comic book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it might have been a distrust of things, distrust of myself in terms of my abilities. I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork to figure out who I was. I mean, you have to remember, like when I first started out in art, I was doing licensed work. So I was asked to draw like Dave Stevens or draw like people who drew Looney Tunes stuff or, Batman stuff. I never had a sense of self,
Sure.
and so I was always searching for that, and it took a while to find my own voice. And I thought back to the effect that Bill Sienkiewicz's work on Elektra Assassin did for me, and even some of the what was the other one, the Jimi Hendrix book that he did was amazing. So not that I actually aped his style, but I wanted to see what spoke to me in terms of digital coloring and tools, and so I chose a project that I thought, well, I know myself, or I'm learning to know myself, and I feel like I need to exercise these demons. So yeah, I mean, it was more about that. I mean, that was the hardest thing I think I had ever done up to that point. I mean, I drank a lot, trying to get through that. And I've been a depressive since I was a kid. So I was probably the most depressed I'd ever been, up until that point.
So I would think that would actually help with your depression, is by realizing all this on paper and putting it out there for the world. So it would be kind of like,
it was cathartic. Yeah.
Yeah. But
I mean, I interviewed my go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it had the opposite effect. Instead of being cathartic, it kind of puts you back in that same place. Is that why?
You had to go through, it's like a trial by fire. You had to, you have to go through the flames to get to the other side, to sort of be reborn again, I guess, the Phoenix Rising stuff. But I mean, I interviewed my parents, for a lot of it. And they didn't know I was working on this book. For 3 years, I didn't say anything about this book. I would just ask them questions, pointed questions. I mean, from an early age, I was always looking at self-improvement, self-help. I could have gone one of two ways, with my upbringing. I could have been rebellious and hateful.
Sure.
But I'm more analytical. I want to understand the psychology of things, the psychology of people. And I'm more of an armchair psychologist than I think I'd like to be. I don't know if I would have been good as a professional, but I think knowing the psychology of people, it tells you everything you need to know about interactions and about behavior that can be good and bad, like who to avoid or who to be attracted to. And so I think talking things out, asking them pointed questions, helped me learn a lot about them, and it gave me a sense of understanding. And so by the time I got to the end of the book, I was actually living that end, because in the end of the book, I ended up seeing my sister's first child, and I literally that's kind of where it sort of came to be. So there's a lot of honesty there. But once the book was done, I felt a certain levity, a certain freedom that I could move on with my life, and I didn't have to hold those memories in my head anymore.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. yeah, now they're put out to the world for everyone to see and to share. Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
yeah.
No.
I mean, the
Mm,
book itself, yay, it's done,
mhm.
it's out, but it feels ham fisted. You know,
Hmm.
it is what it is, and I, I'm glad it's done, and I'm glad I've
Mhm.
moved on. So
Sure. And then from there, you published another somewhat autobiographical book called Things Undone.
yeah,
And you want to talk a little bit about that and what the book is about?
sure. I mean, that was again that one's semi autobiographical in the sense that it's about. Well, it came about like somebody had offered me a gig to do a zombie story,
Mm-hmm.
and they sent me the script, and then I was just like, no, I just didn't love it at all. And I'm like, this is just it's not telling me anything. It's not saying anything. And I always want something richer and deeper meaning. I want layers. And
Mm-hmm.
so I said, well, what would I do? What would a zombie story be like for me that would make sense? And so I started thinking about that feeling that I had when you are looking to change your life and
Mm-hmm.
you get to a point where you feel numb, you
Mm-hmm.
feel dead inside. And so I examined that a lot more, and I came up with this script where this guy moves from a bad situation into what he hopes is a better situation to start afresh,
Mm-hmm.
his career, and to get some distance from a relationship that he doesn't think is working. And in that, it's about a guy who works at a game studio,
Mm-hmm.
and it's basically my journey out to Seattle. And I was working at a game studio, basically trying to heal, from the last game studio I worked at, and I'm just like, just dragging my feet. Like it took a lot just to get my sleep situation back under control, and
Mm-hmm.
the my ability to be creative and to perform as a worker. Like, you don't get breaks. You just don't get a break to a mental health break. That's a big
Sure.
thing these days. Back then, you didn't get that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. You
Right.
basically weren't earning money. And so again, it was a little bit of dealing with my depression through comics, and to make light of a situation that was really heartbreaking for me. And it's about a guy who had to basically pull the trigger on a decision that he had to not accept complacency, that he had to move on. And so
And it was done in a different style from North Country, a
mhm.
completely different style. And that's something I wanted to touch upon, because if someone would look at your portfolio
Mm,
and not know it was you, they might think it was like 5 different artists, wouldn't they?
yeah, that's been a problem. I don't know. I
Well,
don't know, man.
it can be a problem and it can be an asset, because sometimes people like want to latch on to one style and be known for that, but then you're less adaptable to be able to do something like, if a story doesn't call for the style that you're known for,
Yeah.
then you can't do that story. But if you're adaptable and you could change your style like you did in this
Hmm.
process, then you were able to essentially create a new style, because that you're pretty good at not even having drawn in that style prior and
Well, that's
trained
not entirely
yourself.
true. I
Oh, it's
actually did.
not? Okay.
I did a
Okay.
storyboard gig based.
Hmm.
Somebody asked me, "Hey, can you do this storyboard gig for this video game
Yeah.
and draw it in this style?" And I was like, "Oh, I love this style. This is great." And
Huh.
so I took some of that information and I adapted it into this new thing. I'm like, I
Okay.
want to do something with this because I think
Hmm.
there's something here.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like these big heads, kind of
Right. Right.
a little more
Yeah.
manga-esque,
Yeah, which
You know,
fit well with the zombie story,
yeah,
and the way that the main character was drawn. And you also used a very limited color palette too, which I
yeah.
think is important to to
And
say.
technique wise, that was a
Hmm.
really different project because I wanted it to be two color. I wanted it to feel like a rock poster because I
Hmm.
don't know, there was just something about the idea
Hmm.
of rock posters and this sort
Hmm.
of handmade quality to it. So like every
Hmm.
page that I did, I had a black line with
Mm-hmm.
registration marks, these little
Mm-hmm.
stickers with X's on it. And
Mm-hmm.
then I would overlay it with marker paper, and I would do
Okay.
all the orange part in black.
Oh,
So I'd
wow. Huh.
scan two separate pages for every page, and then that black,
Oh my gosh.
that orange plate would be
Yes.
the orange. And
Huh.
so I would use colored pencil and spatter and all kinds of fun stuff and
Yeah.
zipatone. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it has a really unique look to it, which I think is great.
And even hand
So that
lettered the
these new
whole thing
students.
too, because I
Wow.
wanted I
Yeah.
wanted a
Well,
hand lettered comic. So
yeah. You're not a control freak at all, are you?
no, not at all. The big thing is I like to try new things. I
Yeah.
don't like to repeat myself, and especially
Sure.
on long projects. Like this
Yeah.
project, oddly enough, only took about 9 months.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah.
So
Compared to 3 years prior for North Country.
yeah,
Huh.
for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think as artists, we're always looking to try and do something new that excites us. Because,
Yeah.
like you said, projects can take a very long time. And in order to sustain that level of quality and interest
Hmm.
and excitement, it's really hard if you're doing the same thing always over and over and
Yeah.
over again. So, I mean, it's like with me and my storyboards, I purposely will change my style just
Mm.
for my own interest, just so I'm not drawing the same type of thing over and over again.
Yeah.
So let's move on from Things Undone, then your
Hmm.
next big project, and you're kind of getting back to your love of superhero comics in that aspect, was called Brawn. And so tell us a little bit about Brawn and how that came about.
Well, I mean, it's in terms of, I had a bigger project before that called the Overman that I did with a friend of mine from
True.
college.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a 20-year project that just finally came to fruition, and it worked out, so that was amazing. I enjoyed doing that.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't do as well as I had hoped, but after that, I ended up getting a job at Sony Online Entertainment. It was around that time, they actually let me work 2 days a week until I got the project done. They were still paying me a full week's wage, and I was working 2 days a week. It was crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, they were hemorrhaging money, but no wonder they closed down.
That's good for you, though.
Yeah, but then after I left Sony after 2 years, I had this project, Braun, that I'd been working on for a number of years, writing and rewriting, and I finally got to this point where I'm like, okay, I think it's ready, and I just churned away, just worked, and I would work on freelance or at a job all day, and then I'd work all night until I'd
Wow.
get it done. So 7 years later, I have this graphic novel, and I'm pitching it around, and nobody wants to publish it. I'm like, okay, this is a good sign. I guess I have to take things into my own hands. And so it was around that time that Kickstarter came out. So that's what I ended up doing. But it's a story about a girl and her robot protector, and they work for a robot reclamation company where they sell, robots that are running rampant back onto the black market or whatever. And at some point, their company, their little outfit, gets taken over by a megacorp, and they are like cataloging all the employees, and they're trying to figure out what Braun is. And Braun is basically a personal robotic assistant. And they were like, well, is he an employee, or is he, if he's not an employee, he doesn't get paid, or whatever. So, but they find out when they scan him that he was actually a secret project that the company that bought them had way back when. So they end up stealing him from this girl, Maven, and her friends at the robot reclamation company end up having to break into the megacorp to free him. And in that, they find out a deep, dark secret of her past. And
Okay.
Yeah.
So, no spoilers here.
No spoilers.
Just cliffhangers, no spoilers.
Yeah, that's all.
so I'm interested in the Kickstarter process. Was it successful? And secondly, would you do it again?
That's a good question. It was successful in that I got to make the book that I really wanted.
Mm-hmm.
I had very generous friends. I didn't have a lot of friends. So I didn't have a huge print run. And not as many people saw the book as they had liked. And Diamond Distribution, I just was looking at the PDF that they sent over to say, sorry, it's a beautiful book, but we can't sell it. I'm like, great. So I couldn't get it distributed.
Gosh.
And I think that happens to a bunch of people who do Kickstarters. But so I ended up selling it out of hand, quite a bit. And I don't know, it's rare that you get to work on a project and have it turn out the way you want.
Sure.
And I think I don't think I'd change anything about it. I mean, I tried something new. I tried, there was the way I approached this project was I wanted to focus on shapes more, character shapes and opening up panels more. It was something different than I hadn't really focused on before. And so I think in doing that, I got to do the book I wanted to do. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to do that again. I have one more project. Like if I got to do no other comics, I have at least one more project that I wished I could do, but I don't know if I'd go with Kickstarter again.
Okay.
It's the landscape is so different now in terms of like trying to, go on social media to promote books. I don't know if it would do well. I mean, I have another project that I was working on with a guy recently, and we could not get it. We could not get it picked up by any legitimate book publishers or comic book publishers. And to do it on Kickstarter, it's like, I don't know, man. I don't know. It's such a long process.
It is. Yeah. I've never done one, but that's how I was curious to learn about your experience doing it.
I mean, I was super prepared, so everything went so smoothly, and I did the research and I designed the book, and I had the only person I hired was somebody to do production design to work with the printer, and that was it. It was a smashing success, and I just couldn't get it distributed. So it was like, what the hell?
Yeah, it was a beautiful project. Absolute beautiful product. Yeah. Yeah, you did it. As you always do. You always do a good job at your with your books. Well, because you have that design sense too, and you're not just an illustrator. So you have the ability to kind of encapsulate everything into a really beautiful looking package.
Sometimes that's a hindrance though. Like when I take on a project, I see the end product, I see the package, I see it all done. And then it's a matter of like, how do I get to that? How do I put it everything? And so sometimes I don't waver. Like I'm a little inflexible, I think, in some things. And I like to work with people who are my equal or better. And I'm not saying I'm like great, but I have a hard time working with some people who just don't show up. And when they do show up, it's like electricity. Like once you get a taste of that, you don't want to work with hacks. That's why we're like working with, people like you.
Oh, thanks, Shane. Speaking of which, so obviously you and I are rebranding your channel, which was once called The Process. Now it's called Beyond the Process. We have a lot in store for our audience upcoming. We're going to be interviewing a lot of creatives in the fields of storyboards, comic books, film, animation, video games. Shane and I will be doing our own discussions. I think the very first hot button topic we're going to discuss is AI technology and how it's affecting and going to affect the entire creative field, not just artists, but anyone who is involved in the art of storytelling. We're going to be probably doing more than one discussion on that. And then the third arm of our channel, if there's a 3-armed monster that makes sense,
there definitely is.
is going to be process videos. We're still going to be, as Shane had already started with the channel, demonstrating his process. We're going to be doing kind of like mini tutorials and helping you, the audience out there, to become better artists, to increase your efficiency. We'll be giving you tips also, hopefully, on how to land that first job. Those sorts of things, all kinds of advice. So stick around. We have a lot upcoming. All right. Well, thank you very much, Shane, for lending us your time today and letting us get to know more about you.
Thanks,
I look
Lance.
forward to continuing this podcast with you. I think we're going to have a lot of fun, and there's going to be a lot of value that we're giving out to the audience. So please continue to watch. Stick around. Signing off, I'm Lance Laspina.
And I'm Shane Patrick White. And as always, thanks for watching.